Okay, good evening. It is 6 o'clock. And I just realized I should have said it's 6 o'clock. Good evening, so that you can all say good evening back to me. So we'll try that again. Good evening.
Good evening.
It is 6 o'clock, so we'll get started here. This is the second to the last program in the 2026 Gravestone Viaduct Winter Lecture Series. I don't know how to
Mouthful.
say that on top of Gravestone Viaduct Historical Education Society Winter Lecture Series. It's going to be a big mouthful. Last week you all had to brave the tornado warnings, the torrential rainstorms to get here, and who would have thought this week we would be fighting snowstorms. Thankfully it held off for tonight, and thankfully spring is right around the corner. So our forecast for next week, our last program, is showing mid-50s, overcast, but no rain, no snow, no high winds. So hopefully you'll all be back here with us next week for our last program. That is Wednesday, March 25th, and then we'll see you all back in 2027. I'm glad you all came on tonight. Thank you for being here. It's a really nice turnout. Tonight we're going to hear about some Ohio frontier scoundrels, including a river pirate. But first, since I have you captive, I'm going to tell you about some of our stories. Somebody got it. I'm sorry, I'm getting really lazy with my puns. I've got a lot on my plate, and sometimes I don't take enough time to make them anything less than juvenile pirate jokes. I know the library is usually closed by the time these programs finish, so you can go upstairs and browse our shelves and check out books. But I want to remind you all that we have a vast collection of ebooks, streaming audio, and e-magazines available 24 hours a day in our downloadable collections. If you download the Libby app and connect your library card to it, you can download ebooks to your smartphone. You can download them to your Kindle device. You can even listen to audiobooks streaming in your car, which I do all the time. It's a great way to spend your commute to and from your work, or if you're going on a trip. And it's all free and above board, no pirated books or software to get you in trouble. There. Sorry, Anna, I heard that groan. Our cardio drumming classes are Monday nights at 6 p.m. We do have kits available for anybody who would like to try that out. It's a very popular class, but there's always room for more people to do that. So if you look on your way out, you can see one of our kits out there in front with the advertisement. It's 6 o'clock on Mondays, every Monday night at 6 p.m. Cardio drumming, lots of fun. Our little bookworm story time and craft are Thursday evenings at 5 p.m. and Friday mornings at 10 a.m. Or I'm sorry, 10:30 a.m. No, you can bring your kids at 10. They can just play and pick up books. But they do start at 10:30 a.m. And then our summer reading program this year will be Unearth a Story. It's a dinosaur theme. Our kickoff party will be Friday, June 5th at 1 p.m. We will have the dinosaur puppet show. These aren't little dinosaurs. These are great big dinosaurs. It's going to be a lot of fun. We'd love to see a big turnout there. So tell all your friends and family who have kids, elementary school, middle school age. Friday, June 5th at 1 p.m. a dinosaur puppet show for our kickoff of our summer reading program. For our other programs for teens and kids, please check out our back table back there. We do have brochures and posters. We also have little, if you're interested in those downloadable books, we have little business cards that have the information for the Libby app back there. Okay, the Winter Lecture Series are, of course, brought to you in partnership with our partners, the Gravestone Viaduct Society, and more to talk about that is our programming committee chair, Erica Keller.
Thank you so much. I'll try not to make any waves. Don't make me walk the plank. So this is our second to the last lecture series. It's gone very fast this year. And hopefully the weather does hold out next week. We've been pretty lucky so far, but we do have a snow day on Tuesday and a flood usually by Friday, so we'll just see what happens. But the Gravestone Viaduct Society, if you're first time here and haven't been to the lectures before, the Gravestone Viaduct Society is a historical society in Belair, and one of our main goals is to bring history and preserve the history that is in Belair. And if you visited the walking trail or our park, those are some of our many projects. We do have a current project. If you've seen the park, you've probably seen our construction, and one of the features that will be there is our caboose. We actually purchased a caboose about 2 years ago. Did we buy our caboose 2 years? 2 years ago, and 2 years this summer. And so the finished project is actually going to look like the one on the back table back there. That is our finished project. And currently it's at the Age of Steam Roundhouse in Sugar Creek, Ohio. And that will be in our park area by the viaduct when it's done, hopefully around June. But we do have some exciting things. If you would like to visit the Age of Steam Roundhouse, we are having a bus trip. I don't know if anyone would be interested, but we do have some information on Saturday, June 20th. We'll be taking a train trip to the Age of Steam Roundhouse in Sugar Creek, Ohio. We will visit our caboose if it's still there and say hi. But there is a nice event going on at that time, and we have a lot of information if you'd like to know any more about this on our back table. But the Age of Steam Roundhouse is going to be one of our train trips. We have two. This will be the first one in June. And also, if anyone is interested in learning more about events like this or what the Great Eastern Viaduct does, we do have a membership that you can join to become a member of the Great Eastern Viaduct. There's different levels. Not everybody joins at the same level. You can join at a $25 level or a $50 level or a business level. But we do have, if you join at the $50 level, we do have a beautiful calendar that is free with your membership. And these are all a collection of photos that Dan Frizzy has taken and donated to the library. And we're going to be publishing a calendar per year. And this is free with your membership. Also, there are discounts on train trips and other membership rewards if you do become a member. So we would love to have more members. We'd love to have everyone become involved. And we do have a lot more information on the back table if you'd like to learn more about that. And like I said, this is our second to last. We have one more to go. So just to tell you a little bit about next week's program, Thomas O'Grady will be visiting us next week. He's an instructor of observational astronomy at Ohio University and the director of the Southeast Ohio History Center. And he is going to be presenting the story of Ohio canals, an engineering endeavor that can still be traced in Ohio's landscape. Beginning in 1825, Ohio began constructing its canal system that eventually included nearly 1,000 miles of canal and towpath laced with stone locks, culverts, aqueducts, feeder lakes, and slack water ponds. These canals negotiating Ohio's diverse landscapes as they transversed glacial moraines and the Allegheny Plateau, opened up to Ohio to a world of commerce, allowing the export of surplus grains and manufactured goods and the import of items made in New York, London, and Paris. Learn how the Big Ditch stitched the settlements of Ohio's wilderness together and helped make it a player on the world stage. So we hope you can join us next week for the last installment. And we welcome all that are first time, and we welcome everyone back that comes every week. So excited for a wonderful lecture night, and thank you all for coming.
If you are new with us, if you need to use the restrooms at any time, they are through the hallway and to the left. Our programs are there on that camera. They are live streamed, so you can watch them on our website following our broadcast. And then before I introduce tonight's speaker, I do ask that I know some people were already doing this, thank you, that out of courtesy, you silence your cell phones now. Then we will introduce our speaker. Our guide tonight to shine a light on some of the more shadowy sides of Ohio's history is Gary Williams, a lifelong Ohioan and retired librarian. Gary, we love librarians. Gary resides in Wintersville, Ohio. He is the author of 6 books on Ohio history, as well as a popular guide to hiking. I don't know, I'm having so much trouble reading. Hiking in the Buckeye State. Over the course of his career, Gary served as a bookmobile supervisor for SEO and Caldwell. For those of you who order books through us from other libraries, we are part of the SEO consortium, and that's how we get our books from other libraries. So he served with SEO and Caldwell and continues to share his passion for Ohio's history and landscapes as a freelance writer. He has 3 of his books here tonight for sale, so come up and check out the table after the program. And tonight he'll be talking from a book that does not have for sale. It's out of print, but it's a very good book. It's called Scoundrels, Spies, and Rogues: The Ohio Frontier. Please, everyone, welcome with us tonight, Gary Williams.
Can you hear me fine?
No.
Let's put this on. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, can you hear me now? That's better, okay, all right. We'll do this. Well, thank you. Aaron told you I'm a librarian, and I've been to this library before. It's been a while, but I've been here in the past, but I did not come to the basement and see this nice room here. This is a great facility, and I like the program and what you're doing here. This is a nice program, and I'm happy to be a part of it. So let me start off with the bad guys. I want to talk to you about that a little bit tonight. I think there's some interest in that. As you heard my background, I was a librarian, and obviously a lover of books as every librarian was, but I was involved in the bookmobile program, and that was a little different. It was more practical oriented. I didn't get to pursue my own personal literary passions until I retired. But in retirement, I've become kind of a self-published historian and started out doing my own books on Ohio history. And then my last 3 books I found a commercial publisher for, and I've got those for sale tonight. What I was always interested in was Ohio history. I grew up in Dover originally, and I was in the Moravian churches where I grew up, and the whole frontier time of Fort Lawrence, and a lot of the things were going on there in the pioneer times was always. And when I got out of high school, I worked my summer job before I started college was at the archaeological excavation in Fort Lawrence, which is, you ever been up there, Stub Oliver exit on I-77? They've got a museum that houses the artifacts that they found when we were trying to find the actual location of the fort. And there's a pair of scissors in there, if you go, that I found those scissors. There we go, there, thank you, yes. A major crime. So you want to check that out. So I'm using my credentials as a historian, but it wasn't until I retired that I really got into the writing about the history that I've always been fascinated by. And my first book that I self-published was on the profiles from Ohio's territorials in Europe. It was all people that were in Ohio before Ohio became a state. And a lot of them were your standard heroes, but I had one guy in there that was not. He was the James Wilkinson, who was the commander of the U.S. Army at a time when he was in the pay of the King of Spain as agent number 13. So he was actually commander of the American Army and was a foreign spy. So that was, and he was the one bad guy there. And I got more comments about that one bad guy than I did all the heroes. And I think it was Tolstoy or somebody that looks like Tolstoy said that every happy family is the same, but every miserable family is miserable in their own unique way. And in a way, kind of, that's true, and it's also true of heroes and villains, is, heroes, they're kind of boring. You know what they're going to do. They're going to win, for one thing. They're going to say all the right good quotes and make the moving lines. They're going to do what you want. They're not going to be tempted. They're not going to fail. In real life, we're pretty human. So someone who's more human is more interesting. So every bad guy is unique in his own different ways of making a bad guy. So with that in mind, I did a whole book of bad guys, and I called it Spies, Scoundrels, and Rogues of the Ohio Frontier. That's County's Point in Monroe County on the cover of that book. Unfortunately, it's out of print right now. You can probably get it pretty cheap on Amazon, so you can still get it. But all the copies that I printed up, I sold out of. But one of the people that was most dominant in that book, and probably the most famous bad guy you can think of, would be Simon Gerty. Okay, everybody knows Simon Gerty, so it has a well-deserved reputation. One of my heroes was a good guy. Was John Heckel, a great missionary, and he didn't say many bad things about people because he was such a nice guy. But he called Simon Gerty the most wicked, depraved wretch that ever lived. So that's not a very good endorsement, but that's those are what the reputation that Gerty had. He had a well-deserved reputation on the frontier, but he got a little established more than he had in mind. His brothers were also renegade traders who were with the Indians, and anytime somebody said Gerty, they assumed it was Simon, so he got credit/blame for a lot of what his brothers did. But he does have a reputation. Stephen St. Vincent Benet wrote a short story called The Devil and Daniel Webster, and okay, you know the story. In the story, A man sells the soul to the devil to try to get out of the bargain, and he hires Daniel Webster to be his lawyer. And Satan says, well, okay, but it's my court, my venue, I get to impanel the jury. So he picks out the most evil people in all of hell to be the jury. And Simon Gurney is impaneled on that jury. So that's the credentials he had. And, long afterwards, he thought it was a particularly bad person. He didn't start out that way. Simon Gurney was born in 1742 in Pennsylvania on the frontier at a real rough time and a rough place, and living was hard and life was cheap on the frontier. His father was a fur trader, not a trader, a trader with the Indians. He didn't trap, he did trading with them, and he was involved in Indian trade. And Simon was, I think, the second of 4 sons born. They had a hard scramble life. It was head in the mouth. None of them ever had any education. They were all illiterate. Alcoholism was a problem with the frontier, and apparently with Simon Gurney's dad and with Simon Gurney, it was a problem for them. And in 1751, when Simon was 10, his father was killed in a drunken brawl with an Indian. And so that would have made him fatherless, but his father's partner, a man named John Turner, avenged the murder by killing the Indian and then marrying the widow. So he became stepfather for Simon Gurney and his brothers. This was 1751 when this happened. In 1756, the French and Indian War began, and all of the settlements in the Pennsylvania area were under attack by the Indians. And the area that the Gurneys lived in, it's called forting up. The fort stockade, you could go to the fort in times of attack and hold up there. Well, they went to the fort safety, but they were surrounded and cut off, and they realized they were better off surrendering, and they surrendered to the Indians. Now, the Indians in wartime, if they had children they captured, they tended to treat them well, and they adopted them. And they often got picked to replace family members who had died. So what happened with the Gurney brothers is they got split up. They didn't want the brothers together. They wanted to split them up. So Simon was 15 years old. He was sent to live among the Mingo tribe. And his 2 years younger was James. He went to the Shawnee. And George, who was just 11, was sent to the Delaware. Now, the father, however, didn't fare as well, the stepfather, because the Indians didn't want to adopt older men, because the older men were people who were already fighting against them. So they tended to not treat the male older adult captives as well. And John Turner was singled out for the unique torture of being burned at the stake. Yes, well, if you're queasy, you're going to hear more about this tonight, so get ready. But yeah, to briefly summarize, burning at the stake just wasn't a Joan of Arc type burn them alive thing. The whole purpose of burning at the stake was to keep the person alive and in agony long enough that they were still moaning in the morning. And it was considered grand entertainment, and the whole tribe came around to watch, and it was a big deal to see if you could do ingenious ways of shooting blank gunpowder all over the body, cutting off the ears, things like that. It's what they did. And Simon Gurney, at the age of 15, had to watch his stepfather be burned at the stake. And then afterwards, he was adopted into the tribe like nothing happened, and he lived for the next 3 years among the Mingo tribe. Now, at that point, he was 15 when he went there. Those were crucial years for the 15 to 18, but he got to where he liked the Indian life pretty well. It was a nice life. They didn't expect a lot out of young men, so we got to do a lot of hunting and fishing, and it wasn't a bad lifestyle, and he learned the language. But after 3 years, there was a pause in the war, and the captives got repatriated, and Simon and his 2 brothers returned to white society. Now, at this point, Simon Gurney wasn't particularly ambitious, but one thing he had going for him is he was fluent in speaking Seneca, which is what the Mingo and a lot of the Six Nations Iroquois tribes spoke. So he could always get work as a translator because it was Pittsburgh was on the frontier where the white and Indian society met, and someone who could speak Indian languages was always valuable. So he found work doing translating work at that point, but he didn't rise to any prominence until it was in 1774 a conflict broke out between Pennsylvania and Virginia, of all things. And let's see. I'll try this. It works, okay. Right around where Pittsburgh's at over there was claimed by Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania border was supposed to go 5 degrees west of the Delaware River, but they never surveyed it. Meanwhile, Virginia, which was down in a different part, claimed everything to the north and to the west of their borders, which was all of Pennsylvania and Ohio. They claimed all the way to Duluth. So they both claimed the Pittsburgh area as being part of their colony. So there was a little fighting over it, and it was started out nonviolent, and it got violent. And Simon Gurney allied with the Virginia faction, and he was made a lieutenant in the Virginia militia. And he kind of found he liked having authority and power. It was kind of fun, and he did a lot to intimidate the Pennsylvania government officials who were trying to do their job as county leaders, because he was saying we were part of Virginia. And then when the ultimate plan came, when Lord Dunmore's Report happened in 1774. And that was when Virginia thought if they could fight a war with the Indians, that might help strengthen their claim on the western lands. So they actually raised militia, and it was basically the Shawnee tribe versus the colony of Virginia. Now in this conflict, Simon Gurney was offered a job as a translator and interpreter for the army that was raised by the Virginians. And he got sent down from the Wheeling area downriver to around where Point Pleasant is, which is Point Pleasant down that way. That's where one army was coming up from the south, and the other army was coming down from the north, and they were going to meet there. And they sent Simon Gurney with a message to the commander of the Southern Army. And they picked another man to go with him, another man named Simon. And this was a 19-year-old man named Simon Kenton. So you know who Simon Kenton was. You've heard that name before. He wasn't really Simon Kenton, he was Simon Butler, but he had a love rival that he got into a fight with and nearly killed a guy. He thought he had killed a guy, and he left the area he lived in Virginia, changed the name from Simon Butler to Simon Kenton, and tried to start a new life in the frontier. So he volunteered for this mission along with Simon Gurney. So the two of them came downriver together and kind of formed a friendship. Kenton was only 19, Gurney was 32, but they were both pretty good frontier trackers. They knew how to track in the woods, they knew how to watch for Indians, they knew how to survival skills, they were good shots. So they traveled together, and they got to the point at Point Pleasant where the other army was supposed to be, and they weren't there yet. So they didn't know what to do. They left a note in a hollowed out tree. This tells you how they used to communicate in the army. They didn't have, they didn't have any radio, they didn't have any telegraph. They left a note in a hollowed out tree at the banks of the river where the Kanawha meets the Ohio. And they left enough signs around kind of pointing to it, because Gurney couldn't read the letter anyway, he was illiterate, but he left the orders there, and they actually found them. Now, then they got attacked right after that. They fought a battle, but they won the battle, and then they afterwards started marching into central Ohio where the Shawnee tribe was at. And the one army was coming up, and the other one was coming over. And they sent word that they wanted to sue for peace. And Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, sent Gurney and a man named John Gibson over to make sure that they were serious about surrendering. I mentioned John Gibson. This is one of the books I've got here. This a biography of John Gibson, who Gurney hated more than anybody. And there's a lot of Gurney and Gibson in here. John Gibson was a fur trader who was involved in every frontier conflict from the French and Indian War up through the War of 1812. So he had a very long career, and he was kind of Gurney's nemesis. He was the opposite. He was one of those boring heroes, but it's a good book. Anyway, with after the treaty, they trusted Gurney to make another trip and go around to all the Indian tribes all around Ohio and invite them to a treaty at Fort Pitt, which was somewhere around different spots. And it took 25 days to go to all the Indian villages, and he got word for them all and got them all to come. And this was a time when it was pretty dangerous for a white man to be going among Indians. But Gurney had a rapport. He respected the Indians, and he lived similar, and he spoke some of their languages. So he managed to pull this off. So he actually was a pretty good frontier diplomat when he wanted to be. Now, when the revolution started, he wanted to be on the American side, so he picked the right side and had the right attitude. But he was just considered suspect. The fact that that was the governor of Virginia had been the one that made him be the translator. Well, the governor of Virginia was the royal governor, and he wound up being the head with the Tories, and he was the bad guy. So the fact that Gurney had worked for someone who was employed by the King of England made him suspect. So almost anybody in the Pittsburgh area who had worked for the King's government was considered a possible Tory and was not trusted. So Gurney did minor missions, but he was kind of suspicious, and at one point he was even arrested on suspicion of treason. But he really wanted to make a name for himself. And he found out he was a lieutenant in the Virginia militia that it was fun doing that, and he wanted to be on the American side, but he wasn't getting a chance. So they had one campaign they did in this winter of 1778, where the American Army left Fort Pitt, and they heard there was supplies up near Cleveland that they wanted to see, that there was a cache of supplies. So they went after them with the militia, and they got bogged down in terrible weather, and they didn't see any real bad Indians. They just saw some women and children who they shot, and then they took what they had anyway. And all Gertie's job was to pick out which guy killed a particular Indian. His only thing was to judge a contest between people who wanted to kill Indian children. And he was so disgusted by this thing. The whole thing was called the Squaw Campaign. And they went out thinking they were going to be, military heroes. And all they did was kill a few women and children and come back in the mud and the snow. And Gertie at this point was kind of disgusted. And in March of 1778, he and Alexander McKee and Matthew Elliott, who were two others who had experience with Indian negotiating that were in the Fort Pitt area, who also were suspected of being treasonous because they have British connections. They all left together, and they went from Pittsburgh up to Detroit, which Pittsburgh was the American headquarters, Detroit was the British headquarters. So they had to cut through Ohio to do that. They stopped at all the villages on the way and spread lies and rumors how the Americans were losing, George Washington had been killed, Continental Congress was moving out, they were going to come and kill all the Indians, and all these rumors. And then Gertie went on to Detroit, convinced his brothers to join him too. And he was welcomed in Detroit by the British commander, whose name was Hamilton. And he was called Hair Buyer Hamilton because he had a policy of paying a bounty for scalps that Indians had taken off Americans. So you think Gertie wasn't very well thought of. They didn't think much of Hair Buyer Hamilton. You can imagine he was paying a bounty for the scalps of their family members. And he welcomed Gertie with open arms, and he gave him work as a translator for the British Army to live among the Indians. So he stayed with them, and was kind of what he wound up doing was he had no official title and no official military rank. He was just a translator on the payroll, but the Indians trusted him. If he said, let's go on a raid, they would come with him. So he really was the person that you wanted to have recruit for your missions. So one of the first things they had to do was they had to interrogate a prisoner who'd been captured trying to steal horses. And that was a particularly bad crime for the Indians, and they had sentenced the man to death. They'd already made him run the gauntlet a few times, and they had painted him black. And painted him black is the sign meaning you're the next one to get burned at the stake. So he was in bad shape, and he was beaten a while, and Gertie didn't even recognize the guy who was interrogating. So about halfway through the interview, he realized it was Simon Kenton, his old friend. And when he found out who it was, he confessed to Simon Kenton. He was having traitor's remorse. He actually was regretting switching away from the American side and was having second thoughts about it. And he told his friend Kenton that. And he promised to help him out. And he did. He didn't have enough authority to stop the execution, but he slowed things down enough until somebody could come down from Detroit that could take charge of the situation. And they wound up sending Kenton on to Detroit instead, where he escaped. So he did have a hand in saving his friend's house, his life. He was actually, he was capable of that. But he was still not sure about things. He wasn't sure, which side he was going to be on. His next mission was to go to Fort Wines, which, as I said, is the Bolivar exit. It's up around there. The Americans had built a fort there, which was kind of like on the way to Detroit. So that kind of scared them in Detroit. The forts were getting closer. So they sent Simon Gertie and about a party of about 17 Mingo warriors to reconnoiter the fort and find out what the situation was. And when Kenton found out Gibson was the commander, that was the guy who had arrested him, the guy he worked with in Dunmore's War, and he kind of made it personal and said, well, I'm going to take his scalp. And the rumor got around about that, hey, Simon Gertie looking for your scalp, and they told Gibson about that. And he wrote a letter saying, well, if he shows up, we'll just have to trep him. I had to look up what trepping means. Trepping means to bring the fluid out of the brain. It was an 18th century medical procedure, and Gibson didn't have anything medical in mind when he talked about it. So he basically was dismissing Gertie, saying, we'll just take care of him, I'm not afraid of him. And he wrote the letter. But what happened was Gertie and his party came around Fort Wines, and they saw a messenger had gone into the fort with valuable supplies, picked up, they were very low in supplies. They had clothing, whiskey, of course, and gunpowder for the fort. And they also were going to take letters back to Fort Pitt the next day. So the next day, after they delivered their supplies, Gibson sent them letters to the fort. And then what happened was about 3 miles outside the fort, Gertie's party attacked them. And in the skirmish that followed, the Americans fought their way back to the fort, but they had 2 men killed and 1 captured. And unfortunately, the one that was captured was the one that had all the letters. Now, Gertie couldn't read those letters because he was illiterate, but he took them back to the bosses and they read them, and he found out that John Gibson was making fun of him and was going to drain his brain. And he decided at that point that if he could not be accepted among the Americans, if they didn't want him back, he was going to make himself the most hated of anti-Americans that ever was. And at that time, his heart was hardened, and he became definitely somebody that was bitterly hated anything American. So from that point on, he became a leader of raiding parties. And what he would do that made him so anathema to the Americans is, he used to live around the Pittsburgh area. He would come back to roads he knew and lead Indian parties to kill and scalp people that he knew. These were his former neighbors, and he was leading raiding parties on them. So they offered a reward for him. And, clearly he wasn't very well thought of. And it wasn't just small raids. A lot of what Gertie did, he had some success. He was able to raise Indians, and they trusted him. So he had a lot of success on raids. In 1779, he came across an American party that was taking 6 tons of valuable gunpowder upstream from New Orleans to Pittsburgh, because the Americans didn't have gunpowder. There was no place in America that manufactured gunpowder. We had to buy it off foreign countries, and England wasn't going to sell it to us because they were using it against them. And France and Spain would have, but it would look like that they were at war with us, so they had to do it in secret. So they went down in secret and arranged this deal and brought this gunpowder up. And Simon Gertie found them and wiped out the whole group and stole the gunpowder. So he had some success at that. Another mission he was on in 1780, a British colonel went down from Detroit with a bunch of Indians and 2 cannons. And they took the cannon, this was amazing, they took it from Pittsburgh to middle of Kentucky. All the way down, like the Miami and Maumee rivers, crossed the Ohio and took them into Kentucky and pointed those cannons at a fort. There was no road, they had a real cannon, and they took them all the way down there, an amazing job. And they pointed the cannon at the fort, and the fort realized they were in trouble because the wood wasn't going to withstand the cannonballs. So they surrendered, and Gertie was the one that said, "You better surrender. I'm not sure we can stop these Indians from massacre if you don't surrender." And they did surrender, and Simon Gertie didn't try very hard to stop the massacre, and a whole bunch of them got massacred. So it's another case of Gertie kind of being on the scene and, part of the problem. He wasn't the only bad guy. A fellow that was as bad as him was a man named Joseph Brant, who was an Indian who was a Mohawk. And he was the opposite of Simon Gertie in that he grew up the brother-in-law of William Johnson, who was the richest man in America and the Indian agent on the frontier. And he had his mistress was Joseph Brant's sister. So he wound up having a privileged life. He was educated and converted to Christianity, helped translate the Bible into Mohawk. He became a Mason. He went to London, had his picture painted by Charles Stewart and Gilbert Stewart, and met the king, was written about and was in the high society of London. Brant was considered about the highest that an Indian could rise, where Gertie was considered about the lowest that a white man could sink. But they had some things in common. They both were really good warriors who liked to fight. They both liked to drink, and they both liked to brag. So what happened in 1781 was the culmination of all that. Brant was sent out to the west to help out there, and they were trying to catch George Rogers Clark was in the area. They were trying to capture him, and Brant was with a group with Gertie's brother that saw Clark and wanted to attack them, but they didn't have enough men. They had to wait for Gertie. By the time Simon Gertie got there, Clark was gone. But another smaller group showed up, and they ambushed that group, and they wiped them all out. So they were celebrating that night, and that night, when Simon Gertie and Joseph Brant got together, they got drunk and argued about which one was the better warrior, and they almost killed each other. So Joseph Brant wound up with a leg wound that almost required an amputated leg, and Gertie had a scar on his face that put him out of commission for 9 months. So that's it. And Gertie bragged about it later, said it was the Americans did that, in a battle, but really it was just, it was his own side that did that. So So they didn't get along with the guys on his own side. He also didn't get along with the good guys either. The Ranger missionaries were one of my favorite groups there. They were very put upon people because they were trying to have Christian Indians who were stuck in the middle between two warring sides. And Gertie didn't like it. It had no trouble, had no use for anyone of Christianity or anyone that wasn't into warfare. So in 1781, the mission towns of Shanghai and Jadeput were forcibly evacuated, and the missionary people, the actual missionaries, Heckelowitz Iceberg, were ordered by Gertie to go around to Lake Erie to Pittsburgh, to Detroit, I'm sorry. What they did was, if you got to there, you could take a boat to Detroit. But Gertie said, no, I want to walk them all the way around the long way, and I want you to make it hard on them because I don't want to give them any break. So what happened was the person he gave the orders to took pity on the Moravians. He gave Zeisberger a horse to borrow, took them to Sandusky, and arranged for boat passage. So they were all set to give him a boat ride, but when Gertie came back and found out his orders had been disobeyed, here's how he reacted according to John Heckelowitz' diary. When he found out his orders had been disregarded, he behaved like a madman. He flew at the Frenchman, striking him and threatening to split his head in two. He swore the most horrid oaths respecting us and continued in that way until after midnight. His oaths were all to the purport that he would never leave the house until he had split our heads in two with a tomahawk and made our brains stick to the wall. He had somewhere procured liquor and would at every drink renew his oaths, which he repeated until he fell asleep. Never before did any of us hear any mental rave like him. He appeared like a host of evil spirits. He would sometimes come up to the bolted door between us, threatening to chop it to pieces to get at us. But this was Simon Gertie and his recreation, so that's the attitude he had. Now, fortunately, the next day a boat showed up and they got sent to Detroit, and they were treated well afterwards. But what happened to the Ravens was not as good, though. The converts they had, they went back to the villages they were at before to retrieve some grain from the previous fall, and were set upon by American militiamen who were looking for a raiding party that had passed through. And they caught these Christian Indians and thought, well, we can't hit the bad guy Indians, we'll just kill these good guy Indians. And they massacred 96 Christian women, Indian, and children on March 8, 1782. So that was the Jadeput massacre. And after that, the Indians were completely inflamed and were ready to kill any Americans. And the Americans sent an expedition up against them in the Sandusky area. So this was up in this part of the state. And the person that led the Jadeput massacre was second in command of this group. The commander was a man named Crawford. They voted on the commanders. They met across from Mingo Junction. They ferried across the Ohio. They had 4 canoes to ferry 468 men across the river. Not good planning for war. So they came across there, they elected the officers, and the guy that did Jadeput lost by 5 votes, but he agreed to come along as second command. Well, the commander that went along wound up getting captured, they got defeated, and the commander was the one that they gave the revenge for the Jadeput massacre for. So once again, it's time for another burning of the stake, and Crawford was there, and they described it in great detail because there was a witness that was there talking about it. And apparently Simon Gertie rode a great distance to come watch this. He didn't want to miss the spectacle. And he went up to Crawford and was watching him. And Crawford at one point, when he was in agony, pleaded for Gertie to shoot him because he knew Gertie from the old days. You know, they were on the same side. And he pleaded for Gertie to shoot him. And Gertie said, sorry, I don't have a gun. And he turned to a friend and laughed. And then later on, after Crawford had been scalped, he waved the scalp at the end of Captain's face and said, you're the next one to get this. So more of the good nature of Simon Gertie, he kind of cemented his reputation with that. Another thing he said was he wished that it was Simon Gertie they were burning, or not Simon. He wished it was John Gibson they were burning because that was his big enemy and he really didn't like him. So he was able to hold a grudge pretty well. But anyway, after that, he had one more battle he was in. He led a raid in Kentucky, and they attacked the one town and then took off and ran away. Usually with the Indian raid, you struck real quick and you got out of town real quick. Because as soon as they gathered enough militia to chase you, they went after and tried to retrieve the captives you had. So this time they didn't do that. The Indians stopped at this bend in the Kentucky River, and they just kind of camped out and were leisurely sitting around the breakfast fire. And the Kentuckians on their side thought, well, this is a great chance for us to attack them. So they crossed the river and went after them, and they crossed into a horseshoe bend, and it was a carefully laid ambush that the Indians had laid, and they massacred 70 Kentuckians in 15 minutes. That's a lot of killing in a very short period of time. And one of the ones they killed was the end of Boone's son. So Gertie was like, he stabbed Joseph Brant, he killed Boone's son, he tried to kill Heckerweller, almost anybody in the frontier that Simon Gertie hated. He had quite the reputation. But at this point, the war was almost over, and Gertie realized he could never go home again. They hated him. He did visit, he had his brothers visit him. The one brother that didn't become a traitor visited him, and he sort of semi-retired after the revolution. He was given a farm, a 160-acre farm. He married and had 4 kids, and he seemed to be, doing a straight life or whatever. But the Indian wars were still going on, and they needed Gertie to help keep the Indians kind of stirred up and agitated. So the British in Detroit were kind of using Gertie to come down and keep the Indians stirred up in the war passion. So in 1791, they attacked one village, one station down around Cincinnati, a place called Dunlop Station. And they captured a surveyor outside the fort. Everybody else got inside the fort and was holed up. But the surveyor was burned at the stake within earshot of the garrison. So the garrison could hear him crying in agony all night long and still being alive in the morning. And that was, again, Simon Gertie was right there. If somebody's being set on fire, Simon Gertie was usually there to watch. So he did kind of earn his reputation pretty well. So he came along for that ride too and saw that. And then they sent another army. Before St. Clair's defeat, Arthur St. Clair sent led an army up to attack the Indians up around this part of the state here, Dark County. And they were way under-equipped and not a good force, and they left late in the year. It was bad weather, and they had a surprise attack, and the Indians ambushed them. They aimed their fire at the officers and the artillerymen, and I think out of 1,400 men in St. Clair's army, 950 of them were killed or captured. And the rest threw down their guns and ran back to the next fort as fast as they could. So it was a total massacre. It was the worst defeat ever suffered by the U.S. Army. And after that defeat, Simon Gertie, who fought on the Indian side, was walking around the dead and dying Americans, and he pointed out which officers would be the most valuable scalps for the Indians to take the head off of, so they could have, a great souvenir of the battle. So that's another reputation that Gertie had. At this point, the Americans decided to negotiate, and they'd already lost a couple of battles. They thought, well, let's have treaty talks. And the Indians, when you're winning, you don't feel like negotiating. So they didn't feel like that. They had a big gathering at Defiance, Ohio in 1793, right around here. And over 3,000 Indians were there. It's one of the largest collections of Native Americans in one place at that time. And the only white man that was allowed anywhere near there was Simon Gertie. It was Indians only except for Simon Gertie. He was the only honorary allowed to be there. Another Indian that was there was Joseph Brant, who was arguing that maybe they ought to let white people settle up to the Muskingum Tuscarawas River line. Now that part there be okay for settle, and this part be white, or Indian country. But Simon Gertie said, no, the Ohio River is the border forever, and no white man should be on the other side of the Ohio River. So he marginalized Joseph Brant and diplomatically, and wound up, basically being a war hawk and being even in the war. Now, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, the Indians were defeated. Their coalition ended, and they were no longer a force again, and they had to give up their fort in Detroit. So when that happened, Simon Gertie realized he had to go over to the Canadian side of the river now. They said he was the last person to leave Detroit. When the Americans showed up, the last minute he jumped his horse into the Detroit River and swam across, and he had to stay over the Canadian side because he knew he was hated in America. The only exception to that was, in the War of 1812, the American commander of Detroit surrendered Detroit without firing a shot. It was a disgraceful surrender, and the British took over. For the next year, they owned Detroit again. And Simon Gertie was seen drunkenly on the streets of Detroit saying, here's old Simon Gertie on American soil again. So he's getting his last hurrah in. But that was it pretty much. After that, his wife left him from too many beatings. He died alone and blind, but with his, in bed. He didn't die in battle. But that's the way he finished his life, was pretty much a traitor to the end. So he was one scoundrel. I did a lot on him. I want to talk a little bit about Samuel Mason, too, who was another scoundrel, who was a fellow who was born an aristocrat in Virginia and wound up being one of the biggest crime bosses in the country, one of the first crime bosses. He was actually born in Virginia, and his brother was a brother-in-law of Benjamin Harrison, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and the father of one president and the great-grandfather of another. So he grew up in kind of fancy circles, but like a lot of young men, he came to Wheeling on the frontier as a young man and wanted to make a name for himself. And when the American Revolution started, Samuel Mason was made a captain in the militia. Now, the Battle of Wheeling in 1777, the first time Wheeling was attacked, everybody forted up, and the Indians did a common trick. They paraded near the fort like there wasn't too many and tried to lure the people out. And Mason led his company of 28 militiamen out to chase these Indians, saying there weren't that many. And once they got out, they found out there was a lot more than they thought there was. And 23 out of 28 people in Mason's company were killed. Mason and 4 others survived. Mason was wounded, but he hid underneath a fallen tree all night long and managed to survive. So he stayed in the army afterwards, and he served well. And in 1780, he opened a tavern on Wheeling Creek, just a few miles east of town. Now, there were some rumors in his tavern. A lot of people had their horses stolen while they were at the tavern, but nobody really made anything of it. And then Mason moved on, and a few years later, he turned up in Henderson, Kentucky. And he had an inn there. That's on the Ohio River across from Evansville, Indiana. And he was had a tavern along the Ohio River, became a justice of the peace. He was a prominent guy playing it straight. And then his daughter married a guy, and he didn't like the son-in-law too well, but he put up with it. And then at the wedding, he found out that the daughter and the son-in-law had been running around behind his back a long time without him knowing it. And it was kind of a laughing stock about it. And he didn't take that too well. And we don't know what really happened, but the son-in-law never returned from his wedding reception. We've never seen him again. So we don't really know what happened, and there was no body. But it was enough of a scandal that Samuel Mason had to leave town. So he went on to a place called Diamond Island, which is an island in the Ohio River, and he got the idea there of defrauding boats that were heading downstream. All the folks going downstream, there were either people moving west with all their possessions, also was farmers with their cargo going down the river with all their crop going down to New Orleans to sell it for a lot of money. So then, these were people, they're easy to rob because everything they ever had, they had it right there in the boat with them. So he started robbing people on this Diamond Island, and he expanded out to another island another place on the Illinois side of the river called Cave-In Rock. If you heard of Cave-In Rock, it's if you saw the movie How the West Was Won, it's depicted in that one. It was a place where they robbed and killed and defrauded people heading down the river. What Mason did was he started a business called Wilson's Liquor Vault and House of Entertainment. And the purpose was to cheat them at gambling, defraud them, and water the liquor down, just kind of do things like that. But finally he realized, well, they've got all their possessions, I could have those. So they got into it, they were robbing the people, and as a rougher element came, they were killing people and taking their boats. So basically it was a huge pirate's den on this Cave-In Rock on the Illinois side. It attracted a lot of people, and among them was the notorious Hart brothers. The Hart brothers were sons of a Tory from Tennessee, and they were pretty much lowlifes that tried farming and didn't like it because it was too much work, and they went to turn to crime and were robbers and killers afterwards. And they kind of went on a killing spree around Tennessee and Kentucky, and they got caught and arrested, and while they were in jail, turned out there was 2 brothers, Big Harp and Little Harp. Big Harp had 2 women who were sisters that he traveled with, and Little Harp had a preacher's daughter that he traveled with. Well, it turns out while they were in jail, it turns out that all 3 of the women were pregnant. So the Harps were pretty busy, so they got all 3 of their women pregnant, and they got a little bit of sympathy because of that. But then the Harps wouldn't escape, and the women rejoined them, and they went on another killing spree, and it's rumored he killed up to 30 people in a 6-month period. The Big Harp particularly was known to be a brutal killer. Before he died, he said the only regret he ever regretted killing was when his baby was crying one time and he beat it to death on the rocks. And he did feel kind of bad about that. That was the one regret he had. But all the rest of them, he was pretty proud of. So the Harps were a pretty rough crowd, and they got out to Cave-In Rock, and it got to be where it was, it was almost out of control. One of the Harps, what the tricks was, they captured one boat crew, killed all but one person on the boat crew. They tied him to a horse and then stampeded the horse off a cliff. So that was so much that even the other outlaws at Cave-In Rock thought it was too much for them. And they kind of asked the Harps to leave. And they went on to Kentucky, and they got caught up in some other scheme, and they had to run. They got caught one night, and Big Harp was killed. and they were gonna cut his head off. And he said, "Oh, you're a rough butcher, but cut and be damned." And they cut his head off, and they put it on a pike. And apparently that road is still called Harp's Head Road. There's a road somewhere in Kentucky, you can see the souvenir of that. But after that, Little Harp wound up joining back up with Mason again. And the two of them realized, what they were doing is they were trying to rob boats from people, and then they had to take the boats all the way down to New Orleans and sell the boats and then come back up to Kentucky. And they thought, that's not a good business model. The better thing to do was, after the boat went down to New Orleans and they did all the work, and then they sold the boat, sold their crop, and walked back up with a bunch of money, that's when you do your robbing. So what they did was the people in the at New Orleans, they would follow the Mississippi part of the way back up to the Natchez Trace. You've heard of that road called the Natchez Trace? Well, it was a shortcut to come back up to Mississippi. You took the Mississippi to Natchez, and then you took a shortcut that went straight to Nashville. And once you got to Nashville, you were on the Cumberland River, which flowed north to the Ohio, and you were practically back home already. So the Natchez Trace was the one road everybody took with their pockets full of money back from New Orleans. Well, that was perfect for the operation for Samuel Mason. And what he did was, at this point, the western bank of the Mississippi was owned by Spain. So you had to apply for Spanish citizenship to even live there. So he applied to become a Spanish citizen, lived in Arkansas, crossed the river into Mississippi, robbed people, and went back home to Arkansas where they couldn't get it. So he had a nice little routine going. He even had a lawyer in Natchez lined up. He had a fence lined up to sell his stolen property. He had quite an organization. And people knew that it was him, but you couldn't get you. So they had a reward for $800 for him. He just kind of laughed at it. But eventually he got into enough trouble. The Spanish did arrest him on suspicion, and they were holding him, and they found out they didn't have enough to charge him, but there was enough to extradite him across the river to the American side of the river. And the territorial headquarters was in Natchez. So in 1803, he was sent along over with the other Hart brother and some of his gang to face trial in Natchez. So on their way there, they staged a daring escape, killed the captain of the boat that was taking them, and got away. So they were on the loose again, but now they couldn't go back to the Spanish side in Arkansas. They had to stay around the American side of Mississippi, where they were pretty much wanted dead. And then they upped the reward for $1,000, dead or alive. Now, if you know the old Western thing, dead or alive means, why don't you just kill him? I mean, you can tie him up and feed him and take him for 500 miles and hope he doesn't escape and kill you, or you just kill him, throw him on your horse, and collect the reward, the same thing. So dead or alive is pretty much an invitation to shoot on sight. So previously, when the word was $800, Samuel Mason laughed at it. They got up to 1,000 dead or alive, they weren't laughing as much. So a few months later, a couple of folks showed up named May and Seth showed up in Natchez, and they had a head that was in clay in a jar, and they said, "This is Mason's head, we're here for the reward." And they claimed we bring his head in town to get a reward for it. Now, $1,000 was a lot of money. That was like half the governor's annual salary. So this is where the story gets kind of apocryphal. There's no verification, but you kind of wonder. So apparently, while they were waiting for reward money to be sent for these guys, one of the people recognized one of the folks winning the reward as being Little Harp. So, yeah, now it all comes together. All right. So instead of getting a reward, he got his reward, he got hung. So what happened was on May 3rd, 1804, these two people that came with the reward were hung. Now, we don't know for sure they were hung. We know that they were hung under the names they came under. But we're not sure of that. But we know one thing. After this, Samuel Mason was never heard from again. That was it. That was the end of him. That was the end of his crime ring and the end of the whole escapade. So that's the bad guys. That's a couple of bad guys that were kind of interesting. You have people that were colorful folks in the front here. I do want to talk before I take over questions here. I've got some books on this. This book here, Washington Department, is the entire Revolutionary War as headquartered at Fort Pitt. So all the battles that I was talking about, that I was pointing at, that's all takes place in this. This is the Continental Army was headquartered, the Western Department at Fort Pitt. So this is the story of the American Revolution from there. The John Gibson one I told you about, this fellow was he knew Tecumseh, he knew Logan, he knew White Eyes, he knew all the big chiefs. He was Logan's brother-in-law. He was trusted by the Indians because he learned their language. He was a fur trader who was honest, and he was a trusted American officer. So he was commander at Fort Lawrence in the Revolution. He was commander at Fort Pitt by the time of Yorktown, and he was the governor of Indiana Territory during the War of 1812. He's a really interesting guy. He's the most famous founding father you've never heard of. So to look at it that way, it's an interesting story. Also, I like the outdoors, and I wrote a book on hiking Ohio. I've got 83 different hikes in Ohio. Most of them are 3 to 6 miles. It's kind of geared towards family. You can hike in tennis shoes. You don't need special equipment. I've got other hikes that are harder ones if you want. So if you want any of these things, you're more than welcome. If you want me to come and talk to you, I've got some business cards here with contact info. The books are $30 each. But if you want any two for $55. If you want any 3, it's for $80. And I can sign them if you want me to sign them. But I can talk about Scoundrels a lot, but I'm running long if I do, so I better cut it off now. But I'll take any questions if anybody has them. Yes?
The St. Clair he was talking about, is he the St. Clair that became governor of Ohio?
That's the one. Yes, that's the same guy. Yeah, and he was actually, he served on the frontier campaign with Dunmore and the Revolution, and he was the one that the St. Clair's defeat. He was the governor, and they put the governor in charge of the army, which was not a smart thing to do, as it turns out, because he didn't do too well as a general. But yes, that's Arthur St. Clair, that St. Clair's was named for. Anybody else with questions? Okay, well, I talked long enough for everybody, so I guess I don't have to do any more of that. But if anybody's interested in, and you can look around these books if you want, don't feel like you have to buy them, or I'm going to stare at you if you don't buy it. Don't worry. If you want them, that's great. If not, I've got a speech next week against Liverpool, so don't worry about it. All right,
Thank you.
That is all. Thank you very much.